shores and woodlands of the north, it's history of copper mines and iron ore, the Great Lakes fishery. To the farmlands of the southern counties we'll look around, my friend, at all that waits the sportsman in the state of Michigan. And sometimes when the moon brings out the diamonds in the snow, and the stillness of the forest lies encased in Arctic cold, the wind might whisper through the trees, listen if you can. It tells you of the beauty in the state of Michigan.
Hi there, come on in. When you think of fishing with a bobber, what do you think of? Probably the kind of bobbers we all grew up with. You know, the wait until it goes all the way under, then set the hook. Well, there's a new way of looking at bobber fishing, and Craig Scoff will give us a lesson in what he calls sensitive float fishing. Then we'll take a look at a recent report from the Auditor General's office, which shows that our DNR Wildlife Division isn't giving sportsmen their money's worth. Trophy book, a wild game recipe, and more, so you stay tuned. I'm Fred Trost. It's Thursday night, time for Michigan Outdoors. Most of us who grew up fishing in America used one of these two devices for most of our early fishing, at least, if not nowadays. This is called a pencil bobber, this brightly colored one, and this is what is used oftentimes for crappies, but for most panfish, people have used, at least where I grew up, the Dayton float. Now this sits on the water like that. If you see the red side up, normally it sits halfway like this, but it has a little clip on the inside. You push the button, very easy to use, clip your line through there. What you want to do is set the depth, whether it's 3 feet or 5 feet or more, and that puts your hook down below the surface. Most people put a split shot down near the hook to get that worm to drop down and also balance out the bobber a little bit. And the hooks that people use, oftentimes, unfortunately, they use long shanked hooks, which are too big for the fish. Now they work and they hold the bait, especially night crawlers, but there are a lot of problems with a setup like this when the fish aren't biting the way we'd like them to, when it isn't easy fishing. First of all, drop one of these big floats into the water above some bluegills. Well, you see the big splash? Oftentimes that can spook them a little bit. The floats generally don't sit like they should. They're a little bit crooked, and the main thing is a float that is this big or bigger is very difficult for a fish to take down. Now I'm going to push on it with this piece of coat hanger here, and I have to push. Now right now I'm just letting the coat hanger set there, and it doesn't push down that bobber very much at all. I have to really reef on it to push it under the water. Many fish, when they come up onto a bait like that, they'll grab the worm, they'll pull it, they'll tug it, and they won't pull it under the water, so they'll move it. And look at how much I can move this float, or move this hook down here, and the float really doesn't move. I can move it around in the float, you barely see anything. That's what oftentimes happens with these big bobbers, the big floats. You can't tell what's going on below. But aha, what do you do for the tough fishing, the times when the fish aren't biting that well? Craig Scoff introduced me to what you originally said was European-style fishing.
Yep, because
right?
This evolved in Europe, but now we're taking the European floats and we're using them and designing them for American fish. So we like to refer to it as sensitive float fishing.
Right. Now, Craig went over to Europe and fished on the American fishing team.
In 1987. We fished in the World Championships in Ireland.
So that's where he got the European fishing bug, came back, has float fishing specialists, a little mail order company that sells these little teeny floats. Let me show you what really turned me on to this type of fishing. Instead of the big Dayton float, this is what would be called what we used to call a European rig. We'll call it a sensitive float rig. Great for bluegills, crappies, all kinds of fish. First of all, the line, 1 2-pound test line. On this little line, you see that little thing on there? That's what's called a bobber stop or a float stop. And the float can actually slide up and down the line, and it stops at the point to where you want to set the depth. Most European-style fishing has a couple split shot near the hook, but there's 1 or 2 maybe up there, and then a smaller one below to let that bait float down a little easier. And of course, on the bottom, a tiny, tiny hook. This is a number 18 hook. You can't find them in most tackle shops. I hope in the future you'll be able to. And instead of a night crawler or a half a worm, we have a larva or a maggot. Now this bait right here, you say that's so small, how could that catch a big fish? You'd be amazed at all of the fish in the lakes and streams that feed on these things constantly. It's a perfect bait. And this float, this is a lightweight float, hardly makes any plop at all when we drop it in the water, which is great for casting. Look at that. And that larva floats down to the bottom. Now, the great thing about these, we call it a sensitive float system. Oftentimes, a fish will come up to this larva and won't take it and push it down to take that bobber down. Usually, they come up to the edge of it or near it and open their mouths and suck it in. So the larva is going to make a sideways motion, like that. Go right into the fish's mouth. But look at the bobber up top here, or the float, and look what happens as they move. Just tamper with that. I mean, that bobber moves sideways. When the float does that, that's when you want to set the hook, because the fish has that in its mouth. Now, I know it sounds incredible. Lightweight, 1 pound test, number 18 hook, a maggot, and a real lightweight float. But Craig, the key to this fishing, I mean, you can use minnows and things like that, right?
Oh, yeah.
And we have a lot of things we're going to show you in the next few shows about how this can be done. But the basic way to do it, and the way you taught me that I love, is to use these little critters right here. Now, these are larvae, Eurolarva. You know, that sounds better. They're actually maggots.
They're actually maggots. They're, a lot of people, yeah, they're a little bit iffy on using a maggot.
Oh, they don't like them at all just because these are the things that eat decomposed meat.
Exactly. The only way they can do that is to clean it. So they release an ammonia, and as they're feeding on it, that kills the bacteria. Well, that ammonia is just like the ammonia in a glass cleaner. So actually, those little critters there are just cleaning the inside of that container. I would rather have a kid use those than a night crawler, because they're much more clean.
Isn't that amazing? Maggots are actually cleaning that meat before they eat it. They're very clean critters. The carcass itself may be a little yucky.
Exactly.
But these are great to use for bait. I mean, I imagine there's a lot of them in the water. They fall off a tree.
Well,
I mean,
like 90% of what bluegill and trout eat are aquatic insects that are no bigger than that.
why don't you take one out there and
Okay.
show us how you hook it? Maybe grab
All
one
right.
of those. There's red ones and white ones, and the red ones come from a dye that they put in.
Yeah, they inject turkey meat with a dye, and it stains their insides as they're feeding on
Well,
it.
take that little 18 hook there and show us how you hook them. There's 2 ends to the maggot, the pointed end, which
And
is
the,
the front.
and the flat end. On that flat end, there's a little lip of skin that sticks up right here on the side, okay? And what I'll do is I'll take this hook and I'll just thread it right through that little lip of skin, just like this. Oh.
Now this is key, because if you go through that lip of skin like that, you can use this bait over and over again.
Yeah.
Because remember, when a fish comes upon something this small in the water, it doesn't grab it and pull like it does a worm. Of course, you could with this. I mean, you can pull on that and it'll stay on there. But the fish will suck in the whole larva. And when it sucks in the larva, it moves this float just a little bit. That's when you set the hook and you've got it. Believe it or not, this stuff works. We'll drop this one in here. Down it goes. And this is called, what you might have said was the European style fishing, sensitive float fishing, the maggot, the lightweight float. Believe me, it's the way to catch fish in the 1990s for those fish when they aren't biting. Craig, next week, let's get into some other techniques with these other types of floats and show people how to pull them out when they're not biting.
Sounds good, Fred.
Smaller bobbers do work better for fishermen, but what about smaller shotgun shells for hunters? Well, here's a 12-gauge shell, standard among hunters, a 16-gauge, which isn't as widely available for manufacturers, and a 20-gauge shell, second in popularity to the 12. Now, a 20-gauge has less recoil, less kick, so it's more popular among women and kids because it's more comfortable to shoot. Now, I was curious about what gauges women tended to use who took trophy deer and turkeys. Of the 12 women who took deer with shotguns, 7, the majority, used a 20-gauge. But when it comes to turkey hunting, 10 ladies took trophies, and they favored the larger gauges. 5 took theirs with 12s, 2 with 16-gauge, and only 3 used 20s. Now, the reason is a 20-gauge slug has just about as much oomph as a 12-gauge slug as far as the effectiveness for deer hunting. But when it comes to turkey hunting, the number of pellets you have in a shotgun shell is what gives you the advantage. And a 12 definitely has a lot more pellets than a 20. So despite the less recoil and more comfort with a 20, 12 gauge is definitely recommended for turkey hunting. But that isn't to say that you can't get in our trophy book with a 20 gauge. Karen Center from Linden took this gobbler with a 20 gauge, a 21-pounder from Alcona County. And this Tom had a 12-inch beard, 1 1/4-inch spurs, was taken by Barbara Vitale from Albion. Barbara is 71 years old, and she hunts with a 20 gauge. Mabel Hurley from Lake Orion. Last year was her first year deer hunting. This was the first deer she saw, dropped it in its tracks with a 20 gauge Remington 870. This Lapeer County 8-point had a 22-inch spread. Sue Marsh from Parma took this big 8-point on opening day. She used a Savage Model 99 300 caliber just off this logging road in Schoolcraft County. Women also catch trophy fish at this time of year. This 27-inch channel catfish weighing nearly 11 pounds was caught by Somjay Mock from Roseville. She was using Mr. Catfish bait wrapped in a spawn bag hooked on a Mr. Twister jig. That was in Lake St. Clair. This is the time of year for brown trout in the shallows. Keith Huber from Traverse City caught this 38-incher, a colossal brown trout, still fishing a spot-tail shiner in Lake Michigan. Another April brown trout on the left, Jeff Lear from Milford caught a 30-incher off Manistee, trolling a bomber. On the same trip, his brother Steve caught a 15-pound king. Now this fish is in a different league. It's a brook trout, 17 inches, that's big for a brookie. Brett Birchmeyer from Bridgeport caught it in Lake Michigan near Petoskey.
We were fishing for steelhead, and within the weekend I seen a lot of steelhead brought in. I seen a lot of brown trout brought in, and a lot of the guys were using minnows. So I decided and told my friend, I says, well, we should go get some minnows and try that out instead of spawn. So we grabbed some minnows and we come back, and I tossed the minnow out. Dust started to set in, so I figured, well, I'll go get the lantern. I told my buddy, I says, you watch my line. He says, okay. So I walked up and I'm firing up the lantern, taking my time. I'm thinking, oh, I haven't caught anything all weekend. I'm not gonna catch anything now. Well, I walked back and I had slack line. Well, I picked up my pole and I started yelling at him and I says, well, how come you didn't watch my line? He says, I did. I says, well, it's slack line. What's wrong? He says, well, I don't know. Reel it in, see if you got a fish. So I brought it in. Another guy on the pier netted it for me. And as it was flopping there, I didn't even know what it was. I looked at it and I thought, well, I know it's not a steelhead and I know it's not a brown trout. And I'm trying to figure out what the hang it is. And another guy says, well, you got yourself a dandy brook trout there.
You might say that even though Brett Birchmeyer slacked off when he was trout fishing, he still caught a beautiful brook trout that made him our Michigan Outdoors Trophy Angler of the Week. Another subject we took up last week was a situation where the Drummond Island Sportsman's Club offered the DNR money for some projects and was turned down.
I mentioned to Ray Perez in Newberry a year ago that we had some monies for anything that we could help with, and he said, it doesn't matter how much money you have, we don't have the personnel to be able to go out and do anything anyway, so your money isn't any good to us at this point.
Denny Bailey is one Sportsman's Club president who's been frustrated by what he perceives as a lack of cooperation from the DNR. Now here's the situation. The Drummond Island Sportsman's Club offered the DNR Wildlife Division $10,000 to hire woodcutters to create openings and improve sharp-tailed grouse and deer habitat. A simple project. The problem was the Wildlife Division said they didn't have enough staff to do the cuttings themselves or even to hire outside help. Did you tell them, they said that you told the Drummond Island Club that it didn't matter if they had $100,000, you couldn't use it?
Well, without plans, to spend the money on, without that development, it's hard to utilize those funds at the time. So, yeah, it's habitat-wise, we did not have any in place which to put the money on.
That's the official Wildlife Division response. We did not have any plans in place on which to put that money on. Now, this doesn't add up for a number of reasons. The DNR carries out habitat cuttings like this on a regular basis. The Eastern UP receives a large amount of funding from the Deer Range Improvement Program, which is funded from deer license fees. And these DRIP guidelines require local biologists to have district-wide plans laid out each year for habitat improvement. So these plans should have already been in place. And the DNR only has to mark the trees or the areas to be cut, which takes a minimal amount of time on the part of the DNR. All the work is done by private individuals. DNR employees don't do any cuttings. And the DNR ends up being paid for the trees that are cut by the private logging companies. So the DNR could use that $10,000 to generate even more money. But maybe the DNR Wildlife Division isn't using its staff in the ways it's supposed to develop these projects.
Certainly, we need to really have more time to spend managing the rest of our state lands. We don't do a real good acre by acre analysis of state lands right now because we don't have the time to put into it.
So you are short-staffed?
In a sense, I guess we are, because in order to do a very adequate job and looking over our responsibilities, we're really not doing the best we can do with additional staff. So we do the best we can what we got. Our demands are on state lands, and our surveys and our publics is more and more demanding every year, so our time is committed to different areas. So in some essence, our state management, state lands, doesn't get the critical review that we should be putting in as wildlife biologists.
Well, this is the key right there. Ray Perez states the problem very clearly if you look at what he says. Our time is committed to different areas, so our state management, state land doesn't get a critical review that we should be putting in as wildlife biologists. This statement reflects very clearly what's gone on since the DNR has been steamrolled by the environment. I mean, our fish and game staff, fish and game biologists have been put on the back burner with their projects. The environment has taken over. Charlie Keenan, you're our SOS Bureau Director. You keep an eye on the DNR Commission. How do you size up this situation?
We just received this report from the Auditor General's office auditing the DNR Wildlife Division from 1988 through 1991. And some of the things that this report tells us is that the Wildlife Division has 177 employees, and those employees get their funding, if you will, for salaries and programs from 3 different sources. The main source is the hunting licenses, the money that we spend on licenses. The other sources are the State General Fund and the grants that they receive from the federal government.
Okay, we ought to explain that the hunting license money is supposed to go specifically to game management programs, wildlife management programs for hunters.
That's correct.
It's earmarked for that. Now, the report also said, I know that 116 of the 177 employees of the Wildlife Division received their money from hunting license fees and from some of these other environmental sources.
That's right, from more than one source.
Right, but the question is, how did they spend their time? Did their time match the money?
The report tells us that that wasn't the case, that out of their sample that they tested, that half of the people were at least 15% off in their allocation for time, meaning that if they were going to spend 70% of their time in wildlife management and 30% of their time in environment, they may have spent 45% of their time working the environmental end of it.
Mm-hmm. So that's what this report says, that it is out of whack. We've seen this in the field. We've heard this from the biologists. They don't seem to have enough time for game management. I think we're getting to the heart of what the problem is. Charlie, we also wanted to talk on this show about the walleye propagation program, which seems to have kind of a dubious future in the eyes of many people. We're going to have to pick that up on another show.
Brett St. Pearson has a recipe for turkey cordon bleu that was a runner-up last year in our cooking contest. And anytime we do one of these roll-up recipes, it always goes over very, very good. You're going to flatten your turkey breast, and you could use rabbit or grouse or goose or anything else here. Going to layer that with a piece of boiled ham and then a piece of Swiss cheese. If you wanted to use American cheese here, it would go very good. Then you're going to secure these with toothpicks because you don't want your cheese and ham and everything else to kind of ooze out the end while it's frying. Going to roll it very thoroughly in water and then dip it in flour just to make a coating because you're going to fry those first. And then you just want to fry them just to the point of where they're golden brown because it will continue cooking in the oven. And once they're that golden brown color, you're going to place them in a baking dish, and then you're going to make a rich sauce to put over the top of these. And the sauce is your Velveeta cheese and cream cheese and sour cream. You want to cook that in a double boiler because your cheese will stick because there's no other liquid in this. And there's no other spices in this either. And you really don't need it with the rich sauce. And then just put the sauce over the top, and it doesn't go back in the oven at this point. It's a very festive recipe for this time of year, and you could reheat this very well in the microwave or just serve them cold. I wonder what Bob Garner would add to this.
All you'd have to do is maybe add just a little parsley to the top of it, and it'd be all the same festive holiday colors.
There you go, there's your parsley.
Oh, hey, that's beautiful, okay. Now, isn't that's holiday?
It is, but I tell you the taste of this.
Oh, it is very good.
Now, he would be raving about it if it didn't have Swiss cheese, because Swiss cheese is one of on his hit list of less favorite.
Raving, what do you want me to do? You want me to clap my hands, get up, do a jig on the table?
I will, because I tell you what, this recipe,
It's a good recipe.
it is. And just because it wasn't made with wild turkey, wild turkey tastes so good baked and, in the traditional way. If you cheat and use tame turkey, oh man.
You can't go wrong.
It's perfect. Happy holidays, eh?
It is. Finally, he admitted it. Ingredients for that recipe is in our Outdoor Digest magazine. The address is coming up in just a moment. Here's our new map for our guide report, which tells us they're getting rainbows. The western end of the UP, things are perking up. We're going to be there. I hope to see you outdoors. It's a great place to be. See you next week.
And you want your float to drift with a top speed, okay? Your average steelheader uses a bobber similar to
Next week on Michigan Outdoors, we'll bring you part 2 of Craig Scoff's lessons in sensitive float fishing, more details into the equipment and how it works. And for those stations that are holding their annual fundraising auctions the last week in April, we'll take you fishing on the Captain Nichols, a preview of a trip that will be an auction prize on some stations, our annual Michigan Outdoors summer perch fishing trip in July. All this and more next week, right here on Public TV.
Look at the size of that.